Welcome to this session on Canada's nonprofit labour market, a dual crisis in the making. I'm Susan Phillips. I'm professor and graduate supervisor of the Master Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership at Carleton University. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that our home institution, Carleton University, is situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. For those of you elsewhere, we encourage you to recognize the ancestral Indigenous holders of your land. As settlers, as immigrants and their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this country and hope for a more just future together. Please note that we are recording this session, not the participants. The audience. If you have questions at the end, please put them in the Q&A and we will have them posed to our panelists, although we won't be using your name. The basis of this session is that the philanthropic and nonprofit sector seems to be experiencing a major transition of leadership on one hand, by demographics alone, by potentially the effects of COVID. At the same time, great difficulty attracting frontline workers in the way that might have been easier in the past, and at the same time, seeking to be more diverse and more inclusive. So we have a strong sense that there are big changes afoot. We don't yet have good data, and it's hard to know what's coming, how long, how deep this is, how long it will last. From the Charity Insights Canada project, CICP, that Carleton runs a national panel of 1,000 charities. We survey with a couple of questions every week and provide rapid feedback. We've asked about some of the HR challenges. For instance, we asked about turnover of staff in the last year. 37% said they had staff turnover between 11 and 40% of their staff. 12% said more than 40% of their staff had turnover. Now, that might be because they're very small organizations. You lose one person and those numbers go up. And what are the reasons? Mainly pay and benefits and opportunities elsewhere. We asked in one of our recent rounds of whether nonprofits and charities anticipated issues filling the position they most need to fill. And overwhelmingly, yes. And again, the reasons are compensation and lack of qualified candidates, which suggests and reflects the general labor market competition. So in this session, we seek to better understand the Canadian labor market in general, the issue for nonprofits, particularly in hiring senior staff, and how do we do that while attracting younger staff and being more genuinely diverse and inclusive in our leadership and our employment across the sector. We're joined by three excellent panelists. Justin Smith. Dr. Smith is Associate Professor of Economics in the Lazardis School of Business and Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University. His research and areas of expertise include the economics of education and and labor economics more generally. Joined by Collin Ritch, who is principal of the social impact practice at Boyden Executive Search. Since joining Boyden's in 2018, Collin has developed search projects focused on the nonprofit sector and professional associations, as well as healthcare and life sciences. No doubt some of you have used Boyden's in your search. And third, Hanifa Kassam is manager of the Poverty Reduction Strategy with the City of Toronto, a position she's held since 2016. She's also an alum of the MPNL. We always like to have our alum back, and is a leader with Philanthropic Foundations Canada Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, the JEDI Accelerator, which is a year-long peer learning program for foundations who want to seek to bring JEDI to greater reality in their organizations. So we have a great range, and we'll start with Dr. Justin Smith to talk about the labor market more generally and the implications that we might derive from that for the nonprofit sector. Justin, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I've prepared a few slides here with a bunch of graphs. As an economist, that's sort of what we do. I probably have more than enough here, so I may go a little bit fast, or I may not get through all of it. Hopefully we can. So the first thing I'll say is that when it comes to the labor market, economists are thinking about basically three things. One is, how many jobs are there? So how many people are working or not? How much are they working? So in terms of hours, and how much are they being compensated for that work? So wages. So that's the kind of focus I'll have with this set of graphs here. But I wanted to start out by just going over the basics of what the labor market looks like in the nonprofit sector specifically. So, I've included here all nonprofits excluding government, community organizations, business nonprofits, and government. They all look roughly the same in terms of like the gender, immigration, indigenous, that should be visible minority status, my apologies, education and age. The one thing I'll point out here is that the major thing that stands out is that 3/4 of nonprofits are staffed by women. And then the other sort of things that kind of stand out to me are about half of it is half of employees are immigrants, and sort of a higher fraction than in the general population are also racialized. So these are the kinds of groups that are overrepresented in that labor market, and I'm going to focus on that a little bit when I drill down into the stats later on. So the first question is, how many people are, what share of the population is participating in the labor market? And I kind of did this in sort of a pre-post-COVID kind of comparison. And what you can see here is obviously the big dip is COVID, but the current participation of people age 15 plus is just a little bit below the pre-2020 mean, right? So we are, so what we're looking at here is, so a little bit less of the population is participating in the labor market. And, it's been kind of trending up a little bit in the recent past, but it's kind of ticking back down in the recent month. Now, this is coupled with the fact that as a share of the labor market, so not as a share of the population, but as a share of the labor market, unemployment is actually at basically a historic low, right? So this is, been well represented in the news. There's, there's a lot of people that, a lot of firms that are looking for employees that are having a hard time, and that's because a lot of these jobs are filled up. Okay. And the other side to that coin is that a slightly higher than pre-2020 mean level of people in the labor force are now employed, and that's been trending up steadily over time. So we're kind of back to where we were before everything went south with COVID. Okay, so the summary here is that yes, less of the population is participating in the labor market, but a higher fraction of those that are participating are employed, and that's why we see employment kind of coming back to the pre-COVID levels. Now that's for population as a whole. I mentioned before that what we wanted to do, what I wanted to focus on a little bit was the types of people that are generally employed in nonprofits, and this should say by sex. I said by gender by accident, my apologies there. But I wanted to look specifically at women in terms of their participation, unemployment, and employment. And the one thing that stands out to me is that actually for both participation and employment for women, that's above the pre-COVID levels, right? So a higher share of women are both participating in the market and also employed. And the unemployment rate, of course, is, for both men and women right there at historic lows. So I think that kind of bodes well for recruitment of people, in the sense that there's a larger share of people out there in the labor force, particularly women. Now, this is a bit of a busy graph, but I wanted to take a look at the growth in employment in different industries. So, nonprofits are operating in all of these, or most of these. So what I did here was I compared I started employment growth in January 2018, and I plotted that out in terms of the trajectory up until now. And then on top of that, that black line is population growth. So you'd expect that employment would grow in every industry as long as the population is growing. So what we want to see is that industries that are growing more than the population are the ones where people are going to, and industries that are, so I guess, shrinking are the ones where they're growing at less than the rate of the population. So professional jobs, administrative, finance, health, these are all growing faster than the population. And maybe not surprisingly, things like food and accommodation, agriculture, manufacturing are growing less than the population. So it seems like this is, this is kind of important when you're looking, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Important when you're looking at what's going on. A lot of people are sort of shifting towards those professional administrative type jobs. Probably, I think the most useful set of graphs I have here is about labor market tightness. And this is from the perspective of the employer. So this is how many jobs are there out there that are being posted relative to the number of employed people. So a higher number means it's harder to find workers to fill every available. About the post-COVID labor market is that the labor market tightness is very high, right? Relative to historical standards, usually it was about 0.4 of a job per employee. Now it's hovering around 1, and most recently maybe about 0.8. Okay, so this kind of speaks to how hard it is to recruit people into jobs. Like, it's really hard to find employees. And this one thing that really stands out to me, and this is maybe not a shocker, given what's been going on in the news, is that the labor market tightness in the most recent month that we have data is 4 for health. So 4 jobs for every 1 person looking for a job in health. So if you're a nonprofit working in the health industry, there's a ton of competition out there for jobs. There's also finance and insurance. I mean, that's pretty high. And then you compare that to things like agriculture and fishing, mining, public administration, where tightness is sort of more along the lines of historical norms pre-COVID. So the other angle here is, in terms of work, is, yeah, maybe there's more people working, or roughly the same amount of people working, but how intensely are they working? So that's where hours comes in. The red line is everybody grouped together. And basically, the COVID dip sticks out there, but roughly speaking, we're at hours per week that are about the same as they were prior to the pandemic. Men, maybe a little bit lower. Hours were trending down prior to the pandemic, but have sort of plateaued and stayed at, early 2020 levels. Women, also sort of flat, but maybe a little bit of a trend up in the past year or so. Okay, so not only are women more employed than they used to be, their hours are ticking up just a little bit. And I should mention that these are seasonally adjusted as well. So it takes out that month-to-month variation that you would normally see. And then finally, the thing that's been on people's minds recently is inflation, prices going up. And what I thought I'd do here is compare that to how much people are actually getting paid, right? So the cost of living is going up, definitely. But as it happens, so is the average wage. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is wage growth since 2018. The blue line's wages, the red line is inflation. And so basically, at the beginning of this year, the fact that these two lines cross means that the purchasing power of every dollar of wages you earn is roughly at where it was back in 2018. Okay, so that's sort of good news. At the same time that prices have been going up, so have wages for the average person. Now, there's a huge distribution around that. Some people are much worse off. Some people are probably better off. But I think this is a bit of a good news story. Now, with wages going up, that might not be a great thing for nonprofits, given that pay tends to be a little bit on the lower side in terms of jobs. It might be a little bit more difficult to recruit people if their pay doesn't also rise with the average. And then the green line here is just what economists call real wage. And this is the measure of the purchasing power of your dollars. It's the blue line divided by the red line effectively. So when it's above 100, that means your purchasing power has grown. When it's below, it means it's shrunk since the first year. And like I said before, we're right about where we were in 2018, but there was a significant period where we were actually, our purchasing power was higher than pre-pandemic. So in terms of the takeaways, so a bit of a smaller share of the population is ready and able to work or working versus pre-COVID. So that's the labor force. But the good news is that a larger share of those people is employed, which leads to a higher number of employed people. For the core age population, participation among men is up a bit. For women, it's up by more. Female employment is up compared to pre-COVID. Employment in professional education and health industries is growing faster than the population, which suggests that people are moving into those occupations or they just have more jobs available. But it's plateaued for a lot of other industries. The biggest probably takeaway from my perspective is that labor markets are extremely tight relative to pre-COVID levels. So there's a labor shortage effectively. It's really hard to get people, and that's especially noticeable in health and finance. So for nonprofits working in health, that's going to be a major obstacle. Work hours are pretty flat, and then the purchasing power of wages is roughly as it was pre-COVID. So I think that brings me to the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. In a sense, what this does is to expose the myth that we heard coming out of the US that after COVID there was the mass resignation, that people just didn't return to the labor force. And if I read your graphs correctly, that's not the case. As David Leto from Abacus suggested, we may have a reimagination though of the nature of work and of expectations. And maybe that's something that, Collin, you can address. Are people seeking different things in senior positions? Where are you finding the challenges of finding new senior staff at the executive level and senior levels?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And first of all, it's a great question, and before I get into it, just want to thank you for inviting me on this afternoon. And for those that don't know, much or have not had exposure to executive search, by and large, we're talking roles in the C-suite, CEO roles, executive director roles, VP level roles. We do handle some a little bit lower. So much of what I talk about will be specific to that level within an organization, within a not-for-profit. The organization I work for, Boyden, we're an international executive search firm, approximately 75 offices in about 40 some odd countries. So I have a lot of networks that we tap on to try and get a sense of not only what's going on here at home in Canada, but what they're seeing across the world. And much of it is quite similar, to be honest. And Susan, to your question around the state of work is one that we're still struggling with, and that organizations are still struggling with. And I don't think that organizations have fully felt or understood what the longer term impact of the past 3 years is going to have on their organizations. We have an initial shock that has happened over the last few years. And what we've seen at the highest levels of organization is a higher level of turnover at the C-suite than we have traditionally seen. Specifically at the CEO level, we've seen a significant amount of individuals who maybe would have chosen to retire, 5, 6, 7 years from now, and really the pandemic provided an opportunity for them to, to step into that role a little bit earlier. And what that does is it has a cascading effect. It trickles down very, very quickly. The more substantial the amount of roles in the CEO or at the CEO and executive director level, the more challenging it is to find talent that that organizations would deem ready to take on those roles. So the role that we're playing now more than ever is trying to advise our clients on how they can be creative is not the appropriate word or not the right word, but how they can be more open and willing to accept and be accepting of candidates that maybe provide an opportunity to invest in potential versus those that have demonstrated success at the CEO level, if we're talking about a CEO. So what does that mean for recruitment? It means a willingness to expand geography, where organizations in the past would deem, if you're provincially located here in Ontario or in Ottawa, specific where I am, organizations that in the past would, really only recruit from individuals or look at individuals that are either willing to relocate to a region or are located currently in that region. Organizations are getting much more creative and willing. We're not traditional pre-pandemic, driven by the state of work, driven by what we're doing right now, meeting virtually. I think there's still a lack of understanding on how the impacts of COVID are going to be felt in terms of folks that are not in office with one another doing that work. But that's something that's I think we're going to have to live and see how that unfolds. The other thing that I'll make mention of, and then turn it back over to you for a second, Susan, in terms of what has changed, and we talked about diversity. And there is a significant desire for organizations to continue to diversify at every single level in terms of their workforce. And Justin's data was extremely interesting and enlightening to me. What we're seeing at the executive level is still a lack of invested diversity at the most senior levels of the organization. So there may be diversity that is stretched to lower levels, but it is still something that is a work in progress at the most senior levels. And one of the areas that we're really working with not-for-profit organizations and organizations more broadly across the public sector, where I ply my trade, is to craft job descriptions that are not exclusionary, that are not allowing individuals to find reasons to opt out or not pursue a role. I'm thinking of things like years of service. I'm thinking of things like level of education needed to be even considered for a role. Our advice nowadays is, for organizations that have a desire to bring in individuals that in the past, to no fault of their own, would not have been considered for senior level roles, is to not put filters, to keep the aperture open and allow people to include themselves in those processes and then assess them for the skills that they bring and the experiences that they have, both lived and professional. The other thing that I'll mention, and then I'll pause, is looking at what we would have deemed in the past to be, non-traditional experiences, right? And non-traditional environments where people have worked and again, grown throughout their career. So it's really trying hard to reimagine and reinvent what a leader ought to be, where a leader ought to come from, which were very traditional processes in the past, and really trying to open the eyes and minds of the committees that we work with on these not-for-profit organizations.
That opens to lots of follow-up questions. Do you see much cross-sector movement? That is, people who were in leadership positions in the nonprofit sector moving, say, to the private or public sector, or the other way around? Has that changed in any way in terms of the kinds of candidates you see coming forward for some of those executive positions in the sector?
It's interesting. We were I'm part of a practice group nationally, and we were talking about that exact question last week, and we have not seen it to the extent that, to be honest, we expected. We started coming out of the pandemic here, thought there may be a more fervent appetite for not-for-profit organizations to look to their private sector counterparts that may have experiences that would be valued and valuable, or at least be willing to entertain folks from those sectors. And it hasn't happened to the extent that we expected. I believe personally that we will start to see, out of pure need, we will start to see organizations that are willing to take a leap and be willing to entertain folks that are either going from not-for-profit to private sector or vice versa. My experience, Susan, the harder sell is for not-for-profits to see folks that come with a private sector mindset and a private sector background being successful in what is traditionally more fiscally tight environments, right? Which are the philosophies around how you manage your organization in a not-for-profit tend to be very different than how you manage in the private sector. So I think it would be assessing, one's skill set, personality, abilities to translate what they have learned in the private sector while understanding the constraints that they'll be under in a not-for-profit environment, right? I can also speak specifically to two areas where I work, very, very extensively, and that's healthcare, not-for-profit healthcare, and take it out not-for-profit. I work in the post-secondary environment quite a bit as well. And these are environments that healthcare and post-secondary, which are quite unique and quite complex. And oftentimes it can be very difficult from a governance perspective for people that have again spent the vast majority of their career in a private sector entity to come into environments where the governance structures are very, very different, and it tends to be very challenging for that move, the private to not-for-profit healthcare post-secondary, because of the challenges there in understanding governance and working under collegial governance frameworks, et cetera. So we're not seeing as much as we thought we would, but I do think there's going to be a bit more of an appetite moving forward.
And what about competition within the sector, in the sense of is it consistently harder to fill executive positions in some of the subsectors, or do you find that they're for very large organizations, there's not an issue, the same kind of issue there might be for somewhat smaller organizations? And I do appreciate you probably working with organizations of substantial size to start.
Yeah, I mean, so we're working with organizations of all sizes, but we're not necessarily seeing a substantial difficulty in terms of the interest we're receiving or the receptivity to our outreach. There is still a heck of a lot of folks that are interested in kind of advancing in their career, moving in their career. The challenge we're having, in fact, is more on the organizational side, on the client side, because there has been at the most senior levels, such a more substantial kind of changing of the guard, or so many individuals that have moved on from their roles. It's created a bit of a mid-level gap, right? So traditionally, where you have, as I mentioned, a path of somebody moving through an organization to more substantial senior level roles and preparing themselves for a CEO level role, the conversation now with our clients is shifting more towards, being willing to invest in somebody who shows potential, right? Who may not be immediately at that step yet, but with a little bit of investment from a board, from a CEO, if we're talking about a VP level role, can ramp into a role relatively quickly. So we're still seeing a substantial level of interest in the vast majority of the senior level roles that we're working on. But the types of profiles and individuals that we're seeing now versus 4 or 5 years ago, that's where the shift, that's where the difference is, right? So it's more us working to manage the expectations of our clients and understanding that there is a bit of a demographic shift going on, and that there are folks that you may have looked at and deemed them not ready for a role that you may have to take a chance on. And the other thing we're working hard on, Susan, and what I'm going to say next is maybe a little antithetical to my profession, and if I had a whole bunch of search consultants on here, they may get a little upset with me, but it's really trying to work hard with our longstanding clients on retention and development of their own staff. I think that's an area where oftentimes organizations have not necessarily paid enough attention, right? With all the options out there in the market now, you know, folks like myself are coming knocking on your employees' doors a lot more frequently. And so, you know, you need to give them a reason to want to stay with your organization, be it internal development through your organization, professional development for themselves, or just a better understanding of where they fit within the organization. When we go through recruitments, oftentimes internal candidates are put under a more heavy degree of scrutiny than external candidates. External candidates are looked at as a bit of a silver bullet to come in and solve all the problems of an organization, whereas internal candidates are kind of picked apart, oftentimes unfairly. And so, you know, really trying to understand what you have within your organization and not being afraid to look, you know, at somebody within your organization that may not necessarily be exactly, you know, at the level or what you're looking for at the time, but again, with a little bit of investment, can be brought to the level that you need, right? So that internal assessment, I think, is incredibly important to the success of an organization. Oh, Susan, you're on mute. Susan, you're still on. Susan, you're on mute.
Sorry. We know that the sector hasn't been particularly, historically, particularly good at succession planning, talent development to build out those pipelines. And sounds like there's now a significant price being paid for that. Let me turn to Hanifa. Again, the sector, while is female dominant, not necessarily female led, and for all the interest in having a more diverse, inclusive workforce throughout the ladder, not just at frontline workers. It hasn't, again, been particularly, it hasn't been as inclusive as it might be, and including, I hear, younger workers. So you worked a lot with the younger cohort. What are you seeing in terms of some of the challenges, the changes related to being able to attract and retain more workers from racialized communities, Indigenous employees at a more senior level, and younger employees?
Hello, Susan, and I'm not perfect. And thank you for having me participate in today's session. I wanted to sort of start off by saying that, you know, while I'm here to sort of bring forward a perspective on how to employ justice, equity, and inclusion into practices that either retain or attract diverse employees, that it's not an activity that happens in a silo. And in fact, when thinking about how to approach attracting young people, whether it be for their diversity or other skills and talents that they may bring, really thinking about what and why that is important to an organization, and how it's tied to their organizational strategic plan and directions to evolve as an organization is central to being able to articulate and really drive a sense of inclusion forward within any organization, and thus being something that is appealing to someone who sees that as a value of theirs. But I do want to also step back in highlighting a couple of things that came out to me when Justin was sharing the data in terms of what and whom the nonprofit sector is made up of. It was very clear that the sector is made up of largely women, almost 3/4 so. These women or these people are all also identify as diverse. And with that, although we can't understand from the data the intersectional relationships that are there, that means something. What, to me, are we doing as a sector to ensure that women are being supported in taking on more senior leadership roles, that they're being provided the access and the opportunities without being disconnected from opportunities that may have impacted them, whether they be stepping out from the labor market temporarily or not being able to choose certain types of things that are put on them. So I think it's important to think about as a system, as a sector, how are we thinking about the necessary and progressive shifts that are needed in order to attract and retain talent, but also all of the various types of diverse folks that we want to see as part of this sector moving forward. And I think that also lends into sort of a few things that I wanted to highlight about sort of moving into the how to go about doing that. As I mentioned, tying justice, equity, and inclusion is in part of an organizational strategic plan or direction is really important. And it can act as a driving tool and commitment to an organization. But I think more than that, it's to tie that commitment to very clear and transparent actions. A couple of the things that Collin mentioned were around, thinking about how to internally recruit and to support senior leadership advancement within an organization. And to me, that screams as an opportunity to be really focused on supporting and advancing diverse employees through an internal process. If we know that our senior leadership is not made up of women or people of color, those that reflect the communities that we're working in, then it is incumbent on that organization to also move the needle on addressing that systemically through the actions that they have control over. And so those are the types of actions that I think are really important to not only being able to attract senior leadership that has the diversity and skill set to desire wanting to work for any number of organizations, but I think those are also the things that younger generations are looking to from the nonprofit sector. That these sort of commitments or statements to diversity, equity, and inclusion are no longer enough, and no longer enough to attract young people in terms of being the trade-off for unfortunately some of the things that are also systemic a part of our sector. Justin said it as well. The nonprofit sector is not known for being as paid well as other sectors. And therefore, we have to figure out, how does the value translate for young people wanting to get into the sector? I teach a couple of courses at Centennial College, and I'm always thinking about how I can best support them and help them navigate their graduation and their access to employment later on. While at the same time, 9 times out of 10, those young people are working in an industry that is not the nonprofit sector at the time. And so how do we connect the dots for young people when even when they're in school, they are connected to other opportunities that are not actually what they want to be doing following their graduation? I'm going to pause there to take a sip of water, and then we can go from there.
That really, really thoughtful. When you were a student, you worked on a MyTax funded project with Philanthropic Foundations Canada to develop a series of workshops and guidance for organizations, specifically foundations, around how they might be more attuned to, be more effective at attracting diverse leaders into leadership roles. And now you work with the JEDI Accelerator. Are there any sort of key lessons or key takeaways from the work that you did for those organizations about what they could do more effectively?
I think something I've learned by way of facilitating or being one of the facilitators for the JEDI Accelerator is that no matter the size of your organization, there are a number of opportunities to think systemically about the change that you want to see, starting with questioning why the system that you are working in is what it is. And so one of the things that we've done with the JEDI Accelerator program is with each participating foundation, we've worked with them through an ideation process to get a better sense of, what are the operating norms within their organization and what are the things that keep that norm in place and what would happen if those things were to fall apart and change. And recognizing it's for the purpose of justice, equity, and inclusion, what would that change even look like in the future? And how do we begin to put together a vision where our beliefs and our commitment to justice, equity, and inclusion are the fundamental cornerstone to how and why we do things, versus upholding the status quo, which we know is giving us results that we are not satisfied with. And so it's been a really interesting way to not necessarily promote a specific way of moving forward, but something that is aligned with the incremental and sometimes significant shifts an organization is willing to do, but in a way that works for that organizational size and culture and mandate and so on.
And I have to put a plug in there for the chapter that Christopher Fedette, University of Windsor, did in the book we published with Matard about succession planning and planning for real diversity and inclusion. They have to be fundamentally linked, and truly integrated. He presents some really useful data on that. Any other, before we turn to an open session with the other, bringing Collin and Justin back in, other things that we should think about in terms of how we're recruiting new leadership that is perhaps more attuned to making systemic change?
I want to highlight a really interesting example that came about during COVID while I was working on crisis response in Toronto. And it was something that came out of something called the Community Coordination Plan, where a collective of executive directors began to become really concerned about their leadership pipeline, and through that concern and through their desire to see change, they created their own sponsorship program, something that was driven by community, that was very much so aligned with the values and beliefs that community organizations should be led by not only significant experience and capacity, but also be led and merit be given to the lived experience of those individuals as well. And so through that type of really innovative collective effort, they were able to create a peer-driven initiative that was supporting leadership progression, but in an informal way and through community. So while I think that there are really strategic ways of going about leadership, hiring, and recruitment, I do think that as a sector that's as well connected to each other as ours, I think that there is an opportunity for us to think, to use Collin's word, creatively about perhaps exploring opportunities that aren't ones that we're very familiar with, but ones that could possibly connect the dots in a way that would be more fruitful for the organizations that are searching for both staff at the junior level as well as the senior level.
Great. Thank you. Let's turn to broadening out these the discussion with all three of you. And I want to first of all come back to the question of recruiting millennials. There's been so much written about millennials, that they value authentic work, that they're not institutionally loyal, but recognizing that what millennials are now 35-40% of the management category. Justin, in terms of the broad labor market, is there anything distinctive about that sort of the generational differences, that millennial cohort, which is so significant as we now have to look at as they're now entering not just management, but senior management positions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've certainly heard the stories that you were talking about, but in terms of the data, I don't really think at this stage that there's any like massively notable differences at the aggregate level for millennials. They kind of are following very similar patterns as people, other generations at the same stage. I guess maybe the one difference is that, the prevalence of, I guess what they call gig work or holding multiple jobs is possibly higher than it used to be. But that's pretty much it, I think.
And what about mobility across the country? We certainly learned to work differently during COVID. In the aggregate data, do you see more geographic mobility, or can you pick that up through the data?
You could absolutely. I haven't done that myself, but in some sense, the actual movement of bodies may have slowed down quite a bit since COVID. However, taking jobs that are not in your locale has probably gone way up with the sort of more acceptability of telework. I just from my own personal experience, people I know around here sort of living in Waterloo, but working jobs at the other end of the country. I never heard stories about that in the past, but more recently it's common.
And Collin, what about in the search when you're looking at placing millennials? Are they looking for different things? Do you find organizations willing to hire in leadership positions more frequently where the employee is at a significant different geographic distance?
Yeah, I'll start with the geographic distance. Justin's absolutely right. That is a huge shift that we're seeing, right? Where, as I mentioned in the past, an organization, a national not-for-profit or a provincial not-for-profit that's located in the GTA, would maybe not consider somebody that's in Vancouver, for example, is now willing to consider that individual, right? With some sort of arrangement through telework and travel here and then. But that was not something that we traditionally would see pre-pandemic when organizations maybe didn't have the capacity, the IT capacity, the digital capacity to handle that stuff, and truly just didn't believe that leadership was possible virtually, right? It was something, and to be honest, I think organizations are still struggling with that, right? The presentness of a leader, the tangible conversations that happen in an office. How important are those to an organization, right? There's a lot of variability on that, at the most senior levels. The other thing, I picked up on, Susan, you mentioned loyalty amongst millennials now versus a cohort that maybe is a little bit older, and I don't know that I would deem it that millennials are unloyal to their organizations or aren't passionate about the work they're doing, but there certainly is a massive shift that has gone on in terms of work tenure. gone are the days where you see a CV and somebody, and I'm speaking in generalities, but by and large, gone are the days where you see a CV where somebody has been with the same organization for 15 or 20 years, right? Especially in the not-for-profit sector, right? Where, you know, individuals can be extremely passionate about the work and the organization, but if they're not feeling fulfilled in their job, they're going to look elsewhere. They're going to look for something else. And job tenures now, from my perspective, anecdotally, I don't have the evidence that Justin may have to support this, but anecdotally, we usually see the 5 to 7 year tenures, right, at the most, right? Sometimes less than that, where then individuals are looking for another challenge. And it goes back to my comment before and what Hanifa said in terms of, it's likely because they don't feel as if they're getting the development. If they're looking to move out of your organization, it's because they're not feeling like they're getting the development within, or they don't see an opportunity to advance within that organization. So they're going to look elsewhere for it, right? So it's something where we're, again, for especially boards, which traditionally boards are staffed by individuals who are not millennials, and that is something that is very different for them to observe, right? The movements in one's career tend to them to look unloyal, where it's maybe just a factor of somebody looking for that next challenge, right? I think that's one of the biggest changes we've seen.
And there's lots of myth busting that needs to go on in terms of into that generation. Hanifa, do you have anything to add on this topic? We talked about.
I think something that comes up for me is that much of the work that lies ahead for the nonprofit sector when it comes to its attractiveness and the shifts that need to be made need to be started now by existing executive directors and boards, and needs to be something that is prioritized. And I think that is a really important first step or second step or 10th step. But it's also something that needs to be communicated transparently, recognizing that these shifts are happening and that folks may be interested in moving from one organization to the next. Sometimes I worry that there has been some level of false promotion happening. And I've heard these stories come up already, that I've gone to an organization on the outside and what I've learned has been exactly the type of place that I want to go for. And then you come through the door and you've become this tokenized silver bullet, as someone mentioned earlier. You're also the woman, you're also the person of color, you're also the person that has to sort of handle all of the really difficult decisions that now need to be made. And I think there needs to be some openness and honesty about that type of leadership that is being asked of both millennials as well as diverse individuals coming into an organization, both for their talent and expertise, but also in some respects to be able to handle some of the challenges that previous leaders may not have been able to do so well. So I think that there is a cultural shift that needs to sort of root itself in systemic change, and that type of work can begin more formally right now, and does need to be more transparent than it has been to date.
One of the questions that came in the Q&A is whether is it the case that millennials seem to have a stronger preference to work from home. We're struggling with, who goes back to the office? Do you have to go back to the office? In what number? Do you see any trends across different segments of the labor market in terms of preference for working from home, and therefore what that might mean if your organization expects you to be in the office or somewhere in the job?
Yeah, this is a significant shift. And I mentioned in the chat there, the question of flexibility or, remote work or hybrid, that we're calling a lot of times now, oftentimes would never come up, during a recruitment cycle. It was not a question that candidates even considered. Now it's question 1 or 2, right? What is the state of work for this organization? What type of flexibility will I have in this job? And so it is clearly to us demonstrating that is of extreme importance to candidates and in terms of where they choose to work. And it is a big struggle right now as we continue to come out of the pandemic. It's a big struggle for organizations in terms of how they strike that balance, right? I think it does come down on cohort lines a little bit in terms of millennials, Gen Z and Gen X, et cetera. But I don't know that really any organization yet has kind of figured it out, right? I think there's going to be a lot of trial and error as we go here, but it may be very difficult to revert to where we were, just because everybody has got that taste, right? They've got the experience. They know that work has not substantially suffered from people working at home. They can strike that balance. At the end of the day, if work doesn't get done, you will feel the results as an employee and as an organization, regardless of where that work is happening. And I think the benefits far outweigh the challenges that exist.
Good point.
I think on the other end of that, Susan, however, there are many nonprofit organizations that day in and day out provide frontline services where working from home is not a reality. And so I think the challenge for nonprofits will be to communicate the value of their organization beyond that flexibility, as well as what else that they're able to offer employees in terms of a benefit. And so, maybe it is a couple extra personal days. Maybe it is talking about access to professional development, or going to different training and conferences and that kind of thing. I think we've sort of, I don't want to downplay how many amazing things come out of the nonprofit sector that don't necessarily require a financial additive or sort of are tied to working from home. I think the challenge here is that, or the opportunity perhaps, is finding a way to better market that to support the staff that you would like to see. I also think there's an opportunity to engage with your existing staff base to talk about, what keeps you here? Why are you still, like, if you're, sort of reaching the 7-8 year mark and, recognizing that sometimes that's the itchy place for people, then perhaps there are ways that we can sort of think about more operationally to sort of cue in ways to address the shift that might happen or to prevent it from happening in the first place. So I think that there's some navigation that we can be doing here in a way that is a little bit more thoughtful and intentional, but really communicate sort of the heart of why many people work in this sector in the first place.
Really good point. And we position this as a dual crisis or a dual issue in terms of leadership on one hand, but also on the frontline workers, particularly in caregiving roles where there's been enormous precarity of work, wages haven't been competitive. What do you, and we know from Stats Canada data that some of those positions have been the hardest to fill in social service and in healthcare caring professions at the sort of lower end of the wage scale. What do you see in terms of looking forward a few years of being able to recruit care workers, frontline workers, where the demand in, say, non-profit long-term care, in hospitals, there's in childcare, can we move fast enough to a true decent work agenda with more competitive wages to be able to continue or to be able to attract workers there, which seems to be a serious issue right now?
I think you raise a really important point around decent work and the amount of, not the amount, but maybe the role that the sector needs to perhaps play more strongly with the various orders of governments that often fund and support those roles financially. And so as a system, how are we in many ways defending the workers that we need to be able to support communities, to support families, to support our parents when that time comes, in order to do the work that they're so essential to doing, but also with dignity. And I think that it's challenging to say, what will a couple of years bring. But I would say, like I think about the example that there has been in recent years around in Ontario to support, for example, access to accelerated college degrees or university degrees in order to ensure that the graduation rate is happening at a higher rate, and promoting that within your staff complement to ensure that that is seen as a benefit of the organization and something that an organization will support in terms of ensuring that that staff person has a longer term with the organization. But I do think that there's going to be, a difficult time ahead of us that may not necessarily be augmented by traditional solutions or solutions that we've used in the past, where it may have been like an immigration pipeline or a longer histories of work and less loyalty. Like, I think those are some of the things that are going to be really difficult to tackle. But I think the point is that the sector has power. It contributes enormously to the GDP of our country. And we've seen strides in recent years around how to leverage that power. And I think that there's an opportunity there.